Circling back to one of our top stories, Russian President Vladimir Putin will not be attending peace talks in Istanbul this week. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy had repeatedly challenged Mr. Putin to show up in person, saying that the Russian leader's absence would signal that Moscow was not serious about achieving peace. The White House says Donald Trump will not be at the meeting either. The meeting between Russian and Ukrainian officials will mark the first direct peace talks both sides have had in more than 3 years. American officials, including Steve Witkoff, Ukraine envoy Keith Kellogg, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, are also expected at the talks. For more on that meeting, Graeme Gill, Professor Emeritus for Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney, joins us live. Professor, thank you for making the time to speak with us. So much uncertainty at the moment if this meeting is even going to happen. Mr. Zelenskyy saying he'll only travel to Istanbul if Putin shows up, while Mr. Putin is not on the Kremlin's list for the visit. What are the chances the Russian leader makes an appearance at these talks?
Well, it would be very unusual for a head of state to attend the discussions at this early stage. What happens normally in terms of international relations and international discussions between countries is that lower level officials work out the details beforehand, and the head of state or the foreign minister will then come in right at the end to sign the documents, or perhaps to work out any details that the lower level officials could not work out themselves. So Putin staying away is simply a recognition of that fact. It's also a recognition of the fact that basically what Zelenskyy was doing was engaging in another publicity stunt. I mean, this is what he does all the time. He's playing for the Western audiences to try to ensure that the view that Moscow does not want peace continues to prevail. And that means, he hopes, that Europe will continue to lock in behind him to provide the weapons that he needs, he thinks, to continue the war. So it's not surprising that Putin hasn't turned up. If there was significant progress made early on in the talks, it may very well be that he would come down and make an appearance. But I think it's unlikely. I think that the lower level officials are the ones who will work towards a peace settlement, and we'll just see whether both sides are actually realistically committed to that sort of an outcome.
What do you think these lower level delegations can achieve in this first meeting? What's at stake for both sides?
Well, at the moment, what we have is a situation in which the Russians are clearly winning the war on the battlefield. Ukraine is losing the war. There is no doubt about that. Even the Europeans who have always looked through funny filters at this sort of thing, even the Europeans accept that Ukraine on the battlefield is losing the war. That means that it's much more in the interests of Ukraine to reach a settlement than it is of Russia. If there's no settlement, presumably what's going to happen is that the war will continue on its existing trajectory, and that is that the Russians will continue to gain ground in Ukraine. So Ukraine really needs to end the war as soon as it can in order to keep itself in a better position to be at the end of the conflict than it is going to be if the conflict continues. Because if the conflict continues, ultimately they're just going to lose more and more ground.
Ukraine has repeatedly said, though, that it wants to end the war as soon as possible. It appears that Russia is stalling. I mean, President Putin has repeatedly rejected efforts at securing a ceasefire. Donald Trump has been trying for months now to secure that ceasefire. Why have efforts failed?
Well, because Putin sees what Zelenskyy and the Europeans are doing. If you look at what Zelenskyy said about the ceasefire early on, the proposed ceasefire early on, and look at the Europeans, what they have said, we will use the opportunity of this ceasefire to reinforce Ukrainian forces, to send them many more weapons, and we are getting this so-called coalition of the willing of soldiers to go in onto Ukrainian land to, in some way, ensure that the peace remains. In other words, the ceasefire proposal from Ukraine is simply a stalling tactic to try to get a breathing space in the conflict so that they can build up their forces the better to sustain their opposition to the Russians. So the ceasefire proposals, I think, need to be seen in that light, and Russia's attitude to them should be seen in that way too. I mean, if Russia is winning the war, why would it want to allow a situation in which its opponents can rebuild their forces the better to prosecute the war after 30 days? And let's remember, it was the Russians who proposed these talks in order to end the war. Putin has said for at least the last 9 months he would like to end the war. He's laid down the conditions that he said must prevail before there will be talks. He's moved from that. He's said that these talks are without preconditions. So what you've got to get beyond is the narrative that is being perpetrated in the West, coming out of Europe and coming out of Kiev, which is that Kiev really wants to end the war. Russia doesn't want to end it at all. So clearly, I think it's in both of their interests to end the war.
Both sides say they want to end the war. In your opinion, how should diplomatic efforts play out? What kind of concessions need to be made from both sides for them to move forward in that direction?
Well, at the moment, the stated positions are irreconcilable. However, what we don't know is what are the basic red line issues, and what are those that either side would be willing to move on. Ukraine has said that it wants membership of NATO. But it has also said that it's willing to not have that, providing it has some sort of guarantees, security guarantees. Russia has said it does not want Ukraine to join NATO, but it acknowledges that all the countries in the region should have security guarantees. So there's room for some agreement there. And this was the basis upon which agreement was reached in March 2022, and then the Ukrainians walked away from it. What is more uncertain is the territorial issue, because Putin clearly wants to retain control over Crimea and control over the 4 provinces of Ukraine in which Russian forces are currently active. They don't control all of those provinces, but they're currently active in them, and they control most of them. The Zelenskyy will be unwilling to give ground on those issues, at least in part because of his own position back in Kiev. If he was to be seen to be giving too much away to the Russians, then his political position would become very precarious. So it's not clear how this is going to be worked out. What they decided 3 years ago was that that Ukraine would remain outside NATO, and that the territorial issue would be resolved by further negotiations over the coming period. And it may be that that's the way out. But I think if that is the way out, Russia would want and demand clear undertakings that some of those territories would actually be shifted to Russia, particularly Crimea. So there is some ground for compromise, but the room really is sort of rather limited, I think. But the issue again is that Russia has the whip hand in terms of the battlefield situation, and therefore that puts it in a much stronger position in the negotiations than Ukraine is.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing your insights with us. We were speaking to Graeme Gill, Professor Emeritus for Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney.